Okay, hello everyone. Welcome back to Parsha Insights. And we're going to dive right into Parshat Yitro, which is an action-packed parasha, most often known for the presentation of the Ten Commandments or the 10 utterances, the Aseret HaDibrot. But we're going to look today at Yitro, and this is not the first time that we've seen Yitro. All the way back in Parshat Shmot, we saw Yitro as Moshe's father-in-law. Moshe marries Yitro's daughter, Tzipora, and we're going to take a look at Yitro, who he was, how our tradition is kind of confronting. It's a very difficult question. It's a very challenging notion that Moshe, that the greatest of our leaders, that Moshe Rabbeinu, that his father-in-law was a priest of another religion, and with all of the morality associated with that, in particular in biblical times, understanding that the creation of Judaism was not only a theological revolution, but also a moral revolution. And what the other nations are doing, in particular the Midianites, and what we're reading about them, and how can Yitro be a leader there, and the son-in-law be a leader here? How can this family dynamic work? And what's the role of Moshe's wife and Yitro's daughter in all of this? So we're going to look a little bit at the person of Yitro, who by and large, obviously is deemed to be a positive character. And then we're also going to look at one particular moment in Yitro's life and experience that's relevant to the children of Israel, and how a number of different ways of interpreting that moment that the Midrash shares. So let's jump right into Yitro. Going back a few parshiot, this is not from this week's parasha, but just to note that we're learning about fathers-in-law, and Elazar, the ben Aharon, lakach lo mibnot Putiel. So this is Aharon's son Elazar, who is marrying a daughter of Putiel. So Elazar, then, to use that perfect Jewish word, Elazar, or Aharon's mechutin, is going to be this guy named Putiel. Vatele lo et Pinchas, and Pinchas, who we're going to read about later on, Pinchas was the child born to that marriage. Ele Rashi Avot Haleviim Lishbechotam. Okay, that's part of the genealogical listing. So Elazar there are four sons of Aharon, two perish in that tragic moment, Nadav and Abihu, and then Elazar and Itamar, the remaining sons. Elazar marries Putiel's daughter. Now, who is Putiel? So Putiel is going to be Yitro, and we're going to see that in a moment, that Putiel is the same, presumably the same as Yitro. So Rashi says Putiel Mizera Yitro, that this was a descendant of Yitro. Why was he called Putiel? Because the word Putiel and the word Pitem means to fatten. And in the concept of, I don't know if there's a better English word for this, but fattening animals, and for consumption or for sacrifice. So Pitem Agalim La'avodah Zarah. He sacrificed calves for idolatry. And also Mizera Yosef, also a descendant, Putiel, also a descendant of Joseph. Shepitpet B'Yitro. Pitpet is kind of to encounter or to struggle with his Yetzer Hara. Remember, Joseph finds himself in these situations, in particular with the wife of Potiphar. And here, so this word Putiel is alluding to two facts about this father, about Aharon's mechutin, about the father of this woman who is marrying Aaron's son, and one of them is that he comes from Yitro's line, or Yitro's descent, and Yitro is so called because Yitro was an idolater. One of Yitro's names defines his identity as an idolater. And even when Moshe is a newlywed, and he gets married and establishes his family, and then wants to go back to check on what's happening in Egypt, and check on what's happening back home at the palace, and ultimately get involved in the entire process of the redemption, Moshe goes, as the Parsha describes, Vayelech Moshe, Vayashov et Yeter Chotno. I believe we looked in different points at these teachings, but he goes to his father-in-law Yeter, and as the sages will say, what do you mean Yeter? I thought his name was Yitro. What happened to Yitro? Why are you calling him Yeter? That's an entirely different, look, even in the English, Jether. What is Jether? This is one of the linguistic challenges with how our transliterations are so poor, because the transliterations are all based on, many of them are based on the German spelling. And in German, this letter is the Yot, not a J, but a Yot, and pronounced like a Y. So a German looks at this and says Yeter. And in German also, there's no th. The th is not th, so this is Yeter. And we take it as a J, and that's how Jerusalem becomes Jerusalem. That's how Yericho becomes Jericho. That's only the Anglicization of the Germanic transliteration that gets us all these strange pronunciations, but ultimately the J was never intended to be pronounced. So Yeter, Yeter, he says. Rashi, what do you mean Yeter? Here he is called Yeter, and he had 7 other names, as we looked at before. One of them was Ru'uel, one of them was Yeter, one of them was Yitro, Keni, Chovav, Chever, and Putiel. Yeah. So one point which I just would like to make is that this is not only Moshe's challenge, but ultimately this is Aharon's challenge as well. By challenge, I mean the challenge of being connected to somebody who's named after fattening calves for idolatry. This is Aaron's Mechutin. This is Moshe's father-in-law, all coming from the same family of idolatry. And how do we handle that? So one way of handling that is by okay, and this is just the Talmud and Sanhedrin is a way of furthering the problem. The tribes began to demean Pinchas, and they would call him Ben Putizeh. This Ben Puti, this son of Putiel, the son of Yitro. Do you see this guy who's a descendant of idolaters? Do you see how terrible this would be called an ad hominem attack? They are attacking who he is, not what he's done, but who he is. And they say, okay, look at Yitro. Don't you know that the father of his mother fattened calves for idol worship? And he and Pinchas impudently killed the prince of a tribe of Israel without a trial. Okay, so this is Pinchas ben Elazar HaKohen. Look at the Midrash. The Midrash Tanchuma says, okay, we need to understand the context of Yitro. How is it that he was truly an idolater? How is it possible that this man is engaged in idolatry on the one hand, and on the other hand, that he is a holy man, and that he has connections that his children are married to the descendant of Aaron, to Moshe. His daughter is married to Moshe. So look at this beautiful Midrash, and we'll take a pause after this for reflection for a moment. So the Midrash Tanchuma says the following. It says, Kol shivcho shel otot tzadik liot holech lo etzel avdei avodah zara. Is it possible for this amazing righteous man, for Moshe, to be in the home of an idolater? Hakadosh Baruch Hu mekaneh lovdei avodah zara. Don't you know that God just hates? There's a repulsion. God, who Moshe represents. Moshe is the spokesperson, remember? And Moshe represents God and is bringing God's teachings to the people, is bringing God's presence to the people. So how can Moshe go into the home of Yitro? Okay. Ella, sheyitro ro'eh chartumim shela uvoser alehem. Yitro had been an idolater, had been a ro'eh chartumim. He had been, we know that word chartumim from Paro's household. Those were the soothsayers, I think it's translated. Those were the ones who could do anything. They were the magicians. And Yitro, he was able to do this. He was able to do these things. Vehir her la'asot tshuva. And he had thought of doing repentance. Ad shelo yavo Moshe, even before Moshe had come. So what the Midrash is going to say is, Moshe didn't just show up at this idolater's house. When Moshe met his future wife, his father-in-law Yitro had already repented. He had already thrown away his things. I'm sorry. So Yitro v'kara l'chol b'nei Iro. Yitro had called all the townspeople, all of the people who he had who he had led. V'amar lahem, and he said to them, Ad achshav hayiti mishamesh etchem. Until now, I was serving you. I'm reminded, maybe for another time I could bring the story. There's a very unique case of a Hasidic Rebbe in Poland who renounced it all and moved to the United States and lived in Los Angeles for many years as a regular, non-observant citizen, and then ultimately returned and tried to be a Hasidic Rebbe once again in his later years after a break of like 20 years. It's a remarkable story. But this is what I imagine happening. How do you stop being a Hasidic Rebbe? But Yitro, how does he stop being a priest? He gathers everyone together and he said, Ad achshav hayiti mishamesh etchem. I used to serve you until now. Achshav ani zakein. But now that I've grown older, and the implication of older is now that I've grown wiser, bachru lachem komer acher. You have to choose someone else to lead you. Amad, and what does he do? He stood up, v'hotzi klei tashmishei avodah zarah v'natan lehem, and he got rid of all of his stuff, all of his ritual things that he had, all of the klei tashmishei avodah zarah, all of the vessels that were used for idolatry, and he got rid of them. V'natan lehem, ve'amdu hem v'niduhu, and they stood up and they offered sanctions, and they they cast him away. What is the translation here? They excommunicated him. I'm not sure what the translation is, but basically they excommunicated him. Shelo yizdakek lo adam, v'lo ya'asu lo melacha. They made sure that nobody kaufnisht, but right, that nobody shopped at his stores, that nobody gave him business. Shelo yiru et sono. And nobody, that he wasn't able to tend to his flocks. Nobody would do it for him. Ubikesh min haroim lirot lo et sono. He tried to convince the shepherds to take care of his flocks. V'lo kiblu, and they said, no, you're persona non grata. We can't accept your business. And therefore, lefichach hayu yotzot benotav lirot. His daughters would go shepherd his flocks. So this midrash answers two questions. Question number one, how could Moshe marry into such a terrible family? Question number two, why are the women out shepherding the flock when Moshe encounters them? And this is a question for Rebecca as well. This is a question that has to be, anytime one sees in the Torah the women doing this job, how is this happening? Why is it happening? So the answer to why is a woman doing, how could Moshe marry into this family? Because the family was not so bad. Because Yitro had done tshuva. He had given up his position of idolatry. He had given away all of his idols. And he was ready to begin serving God, or ready to begin doing something better with his life. Why were the girls out? Why were the women out taking care of the flock? Because part of the punishment of Yitro's no longer being an idolater was that nobody would take care of him. Nobody would do business with him. Those are the two answers that the Midrash gives in terms of Yitro. So I wanted to use these first sources as a way of simply providing a little bit of background to who we think Yitro is from the rabbinic perspective. We think that Yitro is deeply connected on a family level to the premier family of the Jewish people at this point, to Moshe and Aaron. And we also think that Yitro, when we say that he is an idolater, we think that he was an idolater, but is no longer, says the Midrash, because if he's still an idolater, then we have a lot of problems, number one, and number two, a lot of halachic problems in particular. Yes, the Torah has yet to be given, But they're going to be probably, how could Moshe break bread with Yitro, with his father-in-law, if he's an idolater? How can he make blessings? When Yitro says, as we'll see in a few moments, when Yitro says, Baruch Hashem, that's a big problem if he's an idolater. Who's Hashem to him? So what we need to say is that Yitro is no longer an idolater. Yeah, Michael. Michael raised your hand.
I'm just wondering, I know it's not the point we're on right now, but given the fact that obviously Aaron's children are the beginning of the line of the Levi'im, is there effectively an exception made for the matriarchal rule? Because by that point, we're getting close to the giving of the Torah and the establishment of matriarchal descent, or is it just still to be considered before that's implemented?
It's a good question. I think the assumption, I don't know if this is going to answer your question. Tell me if it is or not, or if you still have the question. But the assumption, firstly, it is somewhat difficult and complex to put the concept of matriarchal and patriarchal descent back into the pre-Torah times, or even into the Torah. But there is going to be an assumption that some type of conversion took place, and the concept of tribe is passed down through father, not through mother. Mother passes down religion, right. Father passes down tribe. So once we've established a Jewish mother, where she comes from, what tribe she comes from is completely irrelevant. It's only going to be connected to the father, who then will establish his children as being a Levi as long as the birth took place after a conversion to Judaism.
And we're assuming effectively some sort of conversion that's maybe it's a bad comparison, but equivalent to, say, the conversion that Ruth went through.
There has to be a conversion, right? I mean, look, in these early times, it's difficult even to answer the question of who is a Jew, what establishes a Jew, because go back to, who is Isaac marrying, who is Yitzchak marrying, what is the status of Lavan's house, because also, Leah and Rivka, or Leah and Rachel are going to come from of the patriarchs. 3 of them are going to come from. I mean, who was the original Jew? How do you determine that identity in those early years? So at a certain point, you have to cut it off. That point is likely going to be Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah. Here, before the giving of the Torah, was there some type of conversion that took place? Presumably, was Sinai itself a mass conversion for all who saw it? Could be as well. We could determine. We're not going to get into anachronistic halachic expectations and say that they had to have a kosher mikveh and they had to have a beit din, the things that Jewish law determines that we have to have today. To say that Yitro and Yitro's children had to have that's not necessarily applicable. But it's a good question. Okay, ready to move? Any other comments or questions before we move on to one particular moment in our parsha? And that's what we're going to look at today, at understanding one word and how a midrash will go to town. When you see a word that's not familiar, the eyes of the midrash light up and say, now I can do my work. This is great. Okay, so Vayavo Yitro Chotein Moshe. So Yitro, Moshe's father-in-law, came Uvanav, and with his Moshe Uvanav, V'ishto El Moshe. So Yitro, at this point, now there's the reunion. Moshe is establishing himself as the leader. He's left his family. His family has been with Yitro. Now there's a reunion of the family. El Hamidbar Ashehu Chonesham Har Elokim, where he's encamped at the mountain of God. Vayomer El Moshe Ani Chotencha Yitro. So he said to Moshe, sent word to Moshe, I, your father-in-law, Yitro ba elecha. But just note, just another linguistic note, that the word for father-in-law and the word for groom are essentially the same word. The chatan, choten, the word for groom and father-in-law are deeply, deeply connected, and mother-in-law and bride as well. Ani chotencha Yitro. I, not your groom, but your father-in-law Yitro, ba elecha, I'm coming to you. V'ishtecha u'shnei vaneha ima, together with your wife and the 2 children. Vayetze Moshe likrat chotno. So Moshe came out, and you see the dominance of whether this is an expression of patriarchal society or of the leadership of Yitro, because Moshe has been separated from his family. and he learns that his wife and kids are coming. Who does he go out to greet? His father-in-law. That's power. That's a powerful presence. He goes out to greet his father-in-law. Vayishak lo, and he kisses him. Vayishalu ish l're'ehu l'shalom. They ask peace one another, I mean, they inquire into their well-being. Vayavo ha'ohela, they go into the tent. Vayisaper Moshe lechotno et kol asher asa Adonai leFaro leMitzrayim. So Moshe tells his father-in-law everything that was done to Pharaoh and to Mitzrayim. Alodot Yisrael, everything that happened to Israel. Et kol hatla'ah asher matzatam baderech, all of the difficulties that they had encountered. Vayatzileim Adonai, but God had saved them. And now here are the key words. Vayichad Yitro. We're going to leave that for a moment. I understand that the translation is here, but for our purposes of the Midrash, pretend that this word has no translation. And Yitro something. Yitro had a verb. Yitro experienced something. What is it? I don't know. Al kol hatova asher asa Adonai liYisrael, concerning everything good that God had done to Israel, asher hitzilo miyad Mitzrayim, God had saved Israel from the hands of Egypt. And Vayomer Yitro, and Yitro said, Baruch Hashem, Baruch Adonai asher hitzil etchem miyad Mitzrayim. Blessed is God who saved you from Egypt, umiyad Pharaoh, and from the hand of Pharaoh, asher hitzil ta'am mitachat yad Mitzrayim, who has delivered the people from under the hand of Egypt. So we're going to look in a moment at this word, Vayichad Yitro, but I wanted to present for a moment a 17th century engraving by the artist Gérard Jolin of this moment. I don't know if everyone can see it clearly, but it's clear to me on my screen. I don't know if it's clear on your screen, but it's clear to me. It's hard to see what you're seeing, but it's clear here. And this was from a book that described biblical scenes. And this is that moment of reunion between Moshe and Yitro. Sorry, I cut it off a little bit. Moshe and Yitro. Okay, so you have the two children right here, right in the front. And you have, okay, so who are the players here? So we have, presumably, you have Moshe and Yitro. Which one's Moshe, which one's Yitro? It's a difficult question to answer. What do you think? Okay, so here the questions are, which one's Moshe, which one's Yitro? I'm making an assumption that these two, this is called Yitro's Visit. There's a title to I don't remember the original French. I saw it yesterday, but it's the Visit of Yitro. And so assuming the two in the foreground are Yitro, who are the two women and who are the two men? And which one is Yitro, which one is Moshe, and why does that matter? Any thoughts? I'm telling you in advance, I have no answers. There's no guide to this. There's nothing correct. I have opinions, but not answers. David.
I'm going to guess that Yitro is pointing out Moses' two children to say these are yours. Because he hasn't seen them in a while.
Yitro is pointing out the two children. Okay. These two, they're yours. They've changed a lot since you've seen them last.
Yeah.
Good. Any other, Cyril?
Yeah, I kind of think that that's Moses reaching out to his kids that he hasn't seen in such a long time.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Yes.
And he has the so-called horns.
Let's zoom in for a moment. He has
Michelangelo's.
Yeah, interesting. He has the horns, although this incident is happening before those horns would have been acquired on Sinai. But that doesn't mean it wouldn't be in this particular drawing. But there is something on his forehead it's difficult to make out. Yeah, Esther.
I feel that the one on my left, I guess he's your left too. This his hair seems to be darker than the other one, who looks as though he's a bit gray. So the other one, the one that's nearer to the women and the children, would be the father-in-law.
Okay, good. So the assumption you're making is a good one that's made by a number of the commentators, which is that Yitro is older than Moshe. And putting ourselves in biblical perspective and of the norms of those times, maybe we can make that assumption, maybe we can't. And I saw on a website called Al HaTorah that they have actually an analysis of a number of different artistic presentations of Yitro, and many of them depict Yitro and Moshe either of the same age or clearly one being Yitro being older, and that's an interpretive difference right there. Is what's Moshe's relationship to Yitro? Is he the kid genius or the kid prophet, or is he is Moshe of the same age? Are they peers? That's a
The other thing you notice is the man on the right has his arm draped over on the man on the left. And he seems to be leaning on him. So is that Yitro, the older man, leaning on Moshe? On the other hand, who's coming out to meet whom and who's doing the embracing? So I wonder who would put their arms around the other first. Is it Yitro around Moshe or Moshe around Yitro?
Yeah, that's a good question. So my assumptions, I mean, looking at the embrace and looking at their positioning, I had assumed that Moshe was the one on the left, and again, my assumption has no more validity than any of ours, only because his back was turned to the camp, meaning he was coming from the camp. Yitro was coming to where they were camped, so those would be that would be the Israelite camp behind him. So maybe he would be coming from there. The two men behind him, you could maybe say it's Aharon, maybe say it's just two elders, people who are walking, maybe Aharon and Hur. Doesn't matter. Who are the women? Presumably one is Tzipora, as Moshe's wife. Maybe another is Miriam. Maybe another is Yitro's wife. Maybe it's one of the sisters because there were 7 daughters. I have no answers to any of this. And the 2 children, I think, we'll assume who the 2 children are because it's
well, there's more to it than that.
Please.
If you look at the composition of the adults, it's triangular.
Mm-hmm.
The 3 pairs are talking to each other, but no, each pair is facing each other, but all 3 are ignoring the other 2.
Yeah. Wow.
And the child in the foreground is almost saying to whoever is pointing to him, I don't want to be with you. So there's a terrific amount of a number of questions that could be asked about the composition itself. Also, in both of the adult male pairs, the so-called horns or rayonnement are available in both pairs. It's not just Moshe, but also in the other pair, the same sense of a horn is present. And one can continue on and on and on. It's a fascinating composition.
Wow.
Could it be Joshua and her?
Yeah, the tents themselves are anachronistic. They're probably from the 14th, 15th, and 16th century. I doubt very seriously that there were any tents of that manufacture in biblical times.
Wow.
What century was this painting supposedly made?
It was made in the 17th, late 17th.
Okay, so that makes sense. He's using contemporary housing.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I do wonder, talking about the headgear and the turbans, my assumption is that this one on the left is Tzipora. And I say that because of the breasts. I say that because of the idea of the young children, and she is standing there as a mother. And once that assumption is if that assumption is valid, then that means that there is significance perhaps to her headdress, maybe matching that of Moshe, that there's something of the ruling family, which she would not be wearing, presumably, as just as the daughter of the priest. But yeah, okay, we could spend a lot of time on this, and I would love to, but I thought it's just very interesting to see another interpretation of, or another a visual interpretation of that scene in which Moshe is telling Yitro of all the good things happen, and Yitro has a response. His response being Vayichad, being whatever that means. So what does Vayichad mean? Rashi gives a few answers. Rashi says Vayismach Yitro. Sameach, happiness. Zo pshuto. That's simply what it is. And anyone want to give it a shot? This acronym?
Me, I don't know.
And they give us a little hint. They give us the nikudot here, the nikud.
Midrash acher?
Excellent. Umidrash acher. Naasa besaro chidudim chidudim. So the word chad is going to mean something sharp. So chidudim, really what they're talking, full of prickles. They're talking about, I guess, what we would call goosebumps today. I'm not sure of the etymology of goosebumps, why it's called goosebump, presumably the appearance of a feathered goose skin, but the saro chidudim, that he got goosebumps. Why? Or he had some type of reaction, some emotional reaction. Why? Meitzer al ibud Mitzrayim. He was upset at the destruction of Egypt. Moshe said to him, look at all the good things that happened. Look at all the good things. Egypt has fallen. And according to one opinion, so this is the tension. This is the conflict. One opinion, what's Yitro's response? Hey, that's wonderful. Egypt has fallen. Israel has risen. Yay. Second response, Egypt fell. Oh, it's too bad. Hainu de amre inshe. That's what people say, quoting the Talmud. Giura ad asara dare la tevaze arma'a ba'ape. A convert for 10 generations. Don't disparage their ancestors in front of them. For 10 generations. So what are they saying about Yitro? Yitro had embraced being part of the Israelite community. But there was still a connection there. There was still a descent, and one of the Midrashim goes through, one of the commentaries, which I did not include, goes through exactly who Yitro was and what his connection was to the Egyptian people, because he was a Midianite. But they say the assumption here is that Yitro had some familial connection to the Egyptian people, and therefore his response was a conflicted response. That's great, Moshe, you're doing okay. You and your people and my daughter are doing okay, but oy for Egypt. Egypt has been destroyed. Yitro feels in his soul. That's Rashi. Okay, you see, even when Rashi gives these two interpretations, you have to ask, like, what's the whole picture that's being presented? Why is one insufficient? Why, and so on. And I think Rashi here is portraying really two different sides that we might imagine that Yitro has. All of these interpretations are coming from the Talmud. And the Talmud says, it's much shorter in the Hebrew, Vayichad Yitro, Vayichad, whatever that means, Ravu Shmuel. So Rav and Shmuel each offered an opinion. Rav said, She'evir cherev chada al bisaro, that he passed a sharp sword over his skin. That's a euphemism for circumcision. He circumcised himself. That's vayichad, sharp. Shmuel Amar, and Shmuel said, Shenaaseh chadudim kol besaro, that his skin became prickly as he agonized over Egypt's downfall. And then Rav says, Hainu damar inshe, that's what people say, that don't disparage a convert, don't disparage a convert's ancestors for 10 generations, and so on. So you see within the Talmud this debate. Neither would notice what's missing here. What's missing here is the pshat, is the simple understanding. Rashi's first opinion, that it's sameach, vayismach. That's missing from the Talmud, but maybe that's taken for granted, and they want the deeper meaning. What's the deeper meaning? Why couldn't it just say vayismach Yitro? Why couldn't we use the classic word? Because there's something else that needs to be addressed here. Vayichad. Just to give the liturgical connection, is that in the Sheva Brachot, in the blessings of marriage, we talk about the aspects of happiness, of sason, v'simcha, chatan, v'kala, gila, rina, ditza, v'chedva. All of these words for happiness. Gila, again, you could struggle to find a translation in English, but they're all words for happiness. Gila, rina, ditza, chedva. Chedva comes from the word vayichad. Okay, so it appears even in the modern wedding ceremony, vayichad.
Rabbi.
Yeah.
Is this not a lesson in empathy and compassion at times, like when a Jewish person marries a non-Jewish person and they go through the conversion because they want to, but they're coming with a family too. And sometimes the family that has, the Jewish families don't accept, and one don't want to even think about talking about anything that has anything to do with the other religion, as opposed to, you don't have to actually follow the religion or do anything like that, but at least have some empathy for what's with the new child.
Yeah.
No?
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think we very much have evolved in how we interact with converts in that way, with sensitivity for their previous identity and for the families that they've left behind. I think there's a certain voice in halakha that says that when a person converts to Judaism, they are reborn. It's as if they've severed their connections. And there's a more, I would say, sensitive and contemporary approach, which says, no, absolutely not. Absolutely not. We still have sensitivity. They still haven't lost that part of who they are. And I think much of this has to do with how we see other religions and how we see the morality of other religions. I think there's a modern approach that says that a person of another religion can be truly moral. And I think in the ancient world, or even the medieval times, when a person left one religion and came to Judaism, they were leaving a barbaric life behind. They were leaving the cruelty that was inherent in paganism behind, or medieval Christianity, or whatever it was, and they were coming to be part of the Jewish people. That was a very different transition than in contemporary society, where we assume the basic morality of all, at least in the Western world. I think that's a good point. Two more sources, very quick sources. So the Midrash offers another opinion, this word vayichad. It says, don't say vayichad, because oftentimes we will take that chet and turn it into a hey. That's part of what the Midrash has some license to do, is to play with the letters a little bit. Vayihad. You know that word? Yehud. Yehudi. Shena'asa Yehudi. Became Jewish. Yitro, the word Vayichad Yitro doesn't only mean that Yitro rejoiced. It means that Yitro converted. And so according to one, he circumcised himself. According to, which was not necessarily the formality of conversion, but was a way of expressing kinship with the Jewish people. Another one says that it was regret over what happened to Egypt. And yet another Midrash is coming in and says Vayichad is teaching us that he became Yehudi. And why? How do we know this? Because look at what happened right after in the verse. He says, Baruch Hashem. Lama Amar Yitro Baruch Hashem? Because Yitro said, Lo Hinachti Avodah Zara Ba'olam Shelo Avadatiha. He said, I am a serial idolater. I've worshipped every idol in the world. Velo Matzati Eloha Ke'elokei Yisrael. And I have not found a God like the God of Israel. Trust me, I've flown every airline, Yitro says. I've been there. And there's nothing like this God. This one's the best. This God's the best. I know from experience, Yitro says. Atayadati ki gadol Hashem mikol Elohim. I know that God is greater than all other gods. It's unusual. I have to correct this afterwards. but the fact that it says Elohim here is incorrect. Sometimes they will change, or some of the style is to change God's name so that we don't pronounce it. But here it's not referring to God. It's referring Mikol HaElohim, from all gods. And therefore there's nothing sacred about this word. So it should be Elohim and not Elohim. And the comment, wasn't Yitro a searcher? Absolutely. Yitro is, according to this midrash, is certainly a searcher and a seeker, and he's found what he's looking for. The Rabbeinu Bachya, I want to offer one last interpretation of this word vayichad Yitro, and Yitro blanked, rejoiced, circumcised himself, converted to Judaism, regretted over the downfall of Egypt, whatever. One more interpretation. Vayichad Yitro, he says, samach bedavar. Okay, that's the classic interpretation. He rejoiced. He said, v'od yesh lomar vayichad, from the Lashon achdut, echad. Vayichad, echad. Lefi shenit gayer v'yiched et Hashem, that he accepted the unity of God. Uberachoto, and he blessed God. Shneimar Baruch Hashem asher hatzil etchem. So it's a similar comment, but it's a different way, at least linguistically, of approaching that comment, of saying Vayichad Yitro, that Yitro had this achdut. He joined the unity of the Jewish people. And I want to say that's a very inspiring, I think, way to refer to a convert. That somebody who comes, joins the unity, is not a peripheral member of the Jewish people, but joins the achdut of the Jewish people, joins what we call the brotherhood, the sisterhood, the kinship, the family notion of the Jewish people. That's what Yitro achieved. Vayichad Yitro, he became echad with the Jewish people. David.
What I thought about with the word vayichad is the same thing, but it made me think more of Joseph interpreting the Pharaoh's dreams and turning it all into one. He said, oh, these two dreams, that's one dream. Moses, all these good things that you told me, they're one thing. God is great.
Yeah, beautiful.
And then Baruch Hashem.
Beautiful.
And so almost on a level of nevuah, he's pulling all these things together to be one, and then he follows through with a bracha.
Amazing. Yes, there's a beautiful article, which if I can find it, I will get it to you, by Aviva Zornberg on the twins in Rebecca's, in the womb, and how the fear of Rebecca is that she will go from being echad to being divided, and that there's the nature of that unity, of being one, of Joseph's ability to take two ideas and turn it and understand the connection between them, and that Rebecca's fear in having twins is that she'll never have that power, that she'll be divided in two different directions. But it's similar, I think, to what you've shared. But that's thank you. Amazing. Okay, we'll close with that, with an exploration of Yitro, of the person, looking at some of the tensions of how, the very basic question of how can Yitro, how can this idolatrous priest and the holiest leader ever of the Jewish people share a family, and some of the approaches to Yitro in that way, and also understanding Yitro's reaction, an unusual word that the Torah uses for happiness, and understanding how the sages looked at that one word, and with that build this whole palace of interpretation, and understanding and expanding who we think Yitro is, and how we see Moshe's father-in-law, which is very important in terms of interpretation and interpreting these verses. We'll close with that, unless there are any other questions or comments, and we'll wish everyone an amazing Shabbat, and thank you for joining us. And look out for the email next week as to whether it's 2 or 2:15 in terms of the starting time. But in the meantime, wishing you a Shabbat Shalom, and we'll see you next time. If not the same time, then at least the same channel. Thank you.
And Shabbat Shalom, Alice.
Rabbi.
Shalom.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you.